The diner felt warmer the longer Hannah Brooks sat there, as if the golden lights above the booths had decided to wrap around her shoulders the same way Ethan's jacket had earlier in the rain. The Maple Street Grill was not a fancy place. The floors were old checkered tile worn smooth from years of footsteps, and the red vinyl seats had small cracks along the edges where time had slowly pressed its mark. But to Hannah it felt like something rare and almost forgotten, a place where no one was asking her to move along. Caleb sat across from Ethan, leaning forward with both elbows on the table while watching the open kitchen with fascination. The sound of a spatula tapping lightly against the grill mixed with the gentle clink of coffee cups and the quiet hum of a refrigerator near the counter. Ethan returned a few minutes later carrying 2 plates stacked high with pancakes and a small bowl of scrambled eggs on the side. Steam rose from the pancakes, carrying the sweet smell of butter and maple syrup through the air. Caleb's eyes widened immediately. "Those are huge," he said in amazement. Ethan set the plates down carefully and slid a small bottle of syrup toward him. "You should see the weekend orders," Ethan replied with a quiet smile. Caleb wasted no time cutting into the pancakes, the first bite disappearing almost instantly. Hannah watched him eat with the careful attention of a mother who had spent too many nights worrying about the next meal. Ethan poured a cup of hot tea and placed it gently in front of her. "It will help you warm up," he said simply. She wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the heat spread slowly through her fingers. For several minutes, the only sound at the booth was the soft clink of forks and Caleb's happy sighs between bites. Eventually Hannah spoke, her voice quieter than the hum of the diner lights. "I used to teach 3rd grade, she said, almost as if the sentence surprised even her. Ethan looked up, but did not interrupt. "Lincoln Elementary," she continued, "just outside Franklin County. I loved it there." She stared down at the rising steam from her tea. But things change when people start seeing you differently. Ethan rested his arms on the table and listened the way someone listens when they believe silence is more respectful than quick comfort. Hannah took a slow breath before continuing. "After my divorce, everything got harder. I started hearing things people thought I could not hear. Comments in grocery aisles. Parents whispering at school events. Words like lazy and careless and too much." She forced a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Eventually the job disappeared. Then the apartment. And after that the world became very good at reminding me I did not belong anywhere. Caleb paused for a moment with his fork in the air, sensing the heaviness in his mother's voice. Ethan spoke gently, his tone steady and calm. "People can be loud when they do not understand kindness." Hannah looked at him with quiet surprise, as if the sentence had landed somewhere deep inside her that had been empty for a long time. Ethan gestured toward Caleb's plate, where the last pancake was disappearing quickly. But sometimes the truth shows up in small ways. Like a kid enjoying dinner after a long day. Caleb grinned with syrup on his cheek and nodded enthusiastically. The moment softened the air around the table. Outside the diner windows the rain had stopped completely, leaving the streets of Cedar Ridge shining under the streetlights. But inside the Maple Street Grill something warmer than the weather had begun to settle quietly between 3 people who had started the night as strangers. Caleb finished the last piece of pancake with the kind of focus only a hungry child can have, carefully using his fork to gather every drop of syrup left on the plate. The warmth of the diner had begun to settle into Hannah's shoulders, loosening the tight tension that had lived there for months. Around them the Maple Street Grill continued its quiet rhythm. A truck driver at the counter flipped through a newspaper. The coffee machine hissed softly as another pot brewed. Outside the wide window beside their booth the streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, turning the night into a soft golden blur. Ethan leaned back slightly in the booth and watched Caleb with a small smile. "You might be the fastest pancake eater in Cedar Ridge," he said. Caleb grinned, a little embarrassed but clearly proud. "My mom makes good pancakes too," he said quickly, glancing at Hannah. "She used to make them on Saturdays." Hannah's eyes softened at the memory. "Blueberry ones," she added quietly. Ethan nodded as if the detail mattered. "Blueberry pancakes are serious business." Caleb suddenly leaned forward again with the fearless curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to hide his questions. "Do you have kids?" he asked. Ethan's smile grew warmer. "I do. I have a daughter named Lily. She is 9 years old, and she talks more than the diner coffee machine." Caleb laughed at that image, and for a moment the table felt lighter. Hannah wrapped her hands around the teacup again and asked gently, "Is she home tonight?" Ethan nodded. "She is probably sitting at the kitchen table doing homework and wondering why I am late." He glanced toward the clock above the counter. "I usually bring home leftover fries or something small from the kitchen. She calls it the surprise bag." Caleb's eyes lit up again. "That sounds awesome." Ethan chuckled softly. "It makes a long day feel a little shorter." Hannah studied him for a moment, noticing the quiet patience in the way he spoke and the steady calm in his voice. She had met many people in the past year, but most of them carried a quick impatience, the subtle urgency to move past her, around her, or away from her. Ethan seemed different, like someone who had learned that slowing down was not a weakness. After a short pause, she asked, "Does your daughter ever come here?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not often. Late nights are not the best place for a 9-year-old. He hesitated before adding with a gentle smile, "But she would probably like you." Hannah looked surprised. "Why would you say that?" Ethan gestured lightly toward Caleb, who was now carefully stacking the empty plates. "Because Lily likes people who make a room feel warmer." Hannah lowered her gaze for a moment, the comment landing softly but deeply. She had spent so long hearing the opposite that kindness still arrived like something unexpected. Caleb looked between them and then asked the question that children often ask when they sense a change in the air. "Are we staying here tonight?" Hannah opened her mouth, but did not answer immediately. The truth was she did not know where they would go once the diner closed. Ethan seemed to understand the silence without needing it explained. He stood slowly and gathered the empty plates. "How about this?" he said calmly. "You finish your tea, and I will check something in the back." Hannah watched him walk toward the kitchen, the soft light reflecting off the floor as he disappeared behind the counter. Caleb leaned toward her and whispered with quiet excitement, "Mom, I think he is a really nice guy." Hannah looked toward the kitchen doorway where Ethan had gone, and for the first time in a long while allowed herself to believe that maybe kindness had not completely disappeared from the world. The kitchen door swung open softly as Ethan Walker stepped inside the back area of the Maple Street Grill, where the warm smell of grilled onions and butter hung in the air like a familiar blanket. The cook behind the flat top glanced up briefly but did not ask questions. In small towns, people learn quickly that sometimes silence is the most respectful kind of help. Ethan walked toward the older man who stood near the register counting receipts beneath a dim yellow light. The man's name was Frank Dalton, owner of the diner for nearly 30 years, and someone who had seen enough long nights to recognize when life had placed something heavy on a person's shoulders. Frank looked up over his glasses and nodded toward the booth by the window. "They look like they needed a meal," he said quietly. Ethan rested his hands on the counter. "They needed somewhere warm." Frank studied Ethan for a moment, then sighed in the slow, thoughtful way of someone measuring the balance between rules and kindness. "You planning to feed half the county tonight, Walker?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Just 2 people." Frank glanced again toward the booth where Hannah and Caleb sat, Caleb now swinging his feet beneath the table while watching the pie display near the counter. "Kid looks like he could finish the whole pie rack," Frank muttered. Ethan chuckled softly, but then his voice became more serious. "They do not have a place to go tonight." Frank did not answer immediately. The hum of the refrigerator filled the space between them for several seconds. Finally, Frank reached for a small set of keys hanging from a hook on the wall and slid them across the counter toward Ethan. "Storage room behind the kitchen," he said. "Old couch in there. Not fancy, but it is dry and warm." Ethan looked at the keys, but did not pick them up right away. "You sure about that?" Frank shrugged slowly. "My mother used to say a diner is just a kitchen with more chairs. Kitchens are meant to feed people." Ethan nodded with quiet gratitude and took the keys. When he returned to the booth, Hannah looked up immediately, uncertainty flickering across her face the way it does when someone expects to hear that their time somewhere safe has ended. Ethan slid back into the seat across from them and spoke in the same calm, steady tone he had used since the moment he walked across the rainy parking lot earlier that evening. "Frank said you and Caleb can stay in the storage room tonight," he explained. "There is a couch and some blankets." Hannah blinked as if she had misheard him. "You mean here?" Ethan nodded. "Just for the night, so you do not have to worry about the cold." Caleb's eyes widened with excitement. "A sleepover at the diner?" he said with amazement. Ethan laughed quietly. "Something like that." Hannah looked down at her hands for a moment before speaking softly. "People do not usually do things like this." Ethan leaned back slightly and glanced toward the kitchen where Frank had already returned to his paperwork. Some people still do, he replied. Outside the diner the night had grown calm and clear, the rain clouds drifting slowly away from Cedar Ridge. But inside the Maple Street Grill, something even warmer than the lights or the coffee had begun to settle around the small booth near the window, where three strangers were slowly becoming something more than strangers. Later that night, the Maple Street Grill grew quieter as the clock above the counter moved past 10:30 and the last of the late customers finished their coffee. The truck driver folded his newspaper and left a few bills beside his mug before stepping out into the cool Cedar Ridge night. Inside the diner, the lights seemed softer now, the hum of the refrigerator and the gentle clatter of dishes from the kitchen filling the silence. Caleb sat at the booth swinging his legs slowly while watching Ethan wipe down the counter nearby. Every few minutes the boy looked around the diner with the bright curiosity of someone who had suddenly discovered a place that felt safe. Hannah remained seated with both hands wrapped around her empty tea mug, still trying to absorb the quiet kindness that had followed them since the rainy parking lot. She had spent so many nights expecting doors to close that it still felt strange when one remained open. Ethan walked back toward the booth carrying a small slice of apple pie on a plate and placed it carefully in front of Caleb. The boy's eyes widened again. "For me?" he asked with disbelief. Ethan nodded. "End of the night tradition," he said calmly. Caleb did not argue and began eating the pie with careful excitement. Hannah watched the moment and then looked up at Ethan. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan gave a small nod but did not make a big show of the gesture. "Everyone deserves dessert once in a while," he replied. At that moment the diner door opened and a tall man in an expensive coat stepped inside, brushing the cool night air from his shoulders. He looked around the diner with the quick, impatient glance of someone who was used to moving through places quickly. Frank greeted him from behind the register, but the man barely nodded before walking toward the counter. As he passed the booth, he slowed slightly and looked at Hannah and Caleb sitting there. His eyes lingered for a second longer than necessary, and his expression twisted into a small smirk. "Did not realize the diner started offering charity seating," he said casually, loud enough for the room to hear. The words hung in the air like something sour. Caleb froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. Hannah lowered her eyes the same way she had done earlier in the grocery store parking lot. For a moment the room felt very still. Ethan stepped forward quietly from the counter and stood beside the booth. He did not raise his voice, and he did not argue. He simply looked at the man and spoke with the same calm tone he had used all evening. "The diner offers food to anyone who walks through the door," he said. The man shrugged dismissively. "Sure looks like some people are getting more than they deserve." Ethan's expression did not change. He rested one hand lightly on the back of the booth seat beside Hannah and Caleb. "Kindness does not work on a reward system," he said gently. "Sometimes people just need a warm place and a good meal." The man opened his mouth as if preparing another remark, but something in Ethan's steady voice made him pause. The diner remained silent for a moment before the man turned back toward the counter and muttered something under his breath. Caleb slowly lowered his fork and looked up at Ethan with wide, grateful eyes. Hannah looked at him as well, her expression filled with a quiet mixture of surprise and relief. Ethan simply gave a small, reassuring nod, as if defending someone's dignity was the most ordinary thing in the world. And in that quiet moment, the Maple Street Grill felt less like a diner and more like a place where respect quietly drew a line that cruelty could not cross. The diner slowly returned to its quiet rhythm after the man's careless comment faded into the background noise of clinking cups and humming refrigerators. The tall man at the counter ordered coffee without looking back at the booth, as if the moment had already disappeared from his mind. But for Hannah it lingered in the air like a familiar echo. She had heard words like that before, spoken with the same casual cruelty that pretended to be harmless. Yet this time something had been different. Someone had answered without anger, without shame, and without letting the words define the room. Caleb finished the last bite of apple pie and wiped his mouth carefully with a napkin the way his mother had taught him years earlier. Then he looked up at Ethan with the kind of quiet admiration children give to people they decide are safe. "You did not even sound mad," he said thoughtfully. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the edge of the booth and smiled a little. "Sometimes people expect anger," he replied calmly. "But respect works better when it stays calm." Caleb nodded as if the sentence made perfect sense, and then slid out of the booth to look more closely at the row of pie slices in the glass display near the counter. Hannah watched him go before turning her eyes back to Ethan. For a moment she seemed unsure how to speak, as if gratitude had become something too large for simple words. Finally she said quietly, "You did not have to defend us like that." Ethan shook his head gently. "It was not about defending anyone," he said. "It was about reminding the room how people should be treated." Hannah studied his face with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. She had spent so many months bracing herself for judgment that the steady calm in his voice felt almost unfamiliar. Most people would have ignored it, she admitted. Ethan considered that for a moment before answering. Ignoring something does not make it right. The lights above the booth reflected softly in the diner window beside them, showing the quiet street outside where the last of the rainwater still shimmered under the street lamps. Caleb returned from the pie display and climbed back into the booth, his eyes glowing with excitement. "There is a chocolate pie in there that looks amazing," he announced. Ethan chuckled quietly. "That one disappears fast around here." Caleb leaned forward with sudden seriousness. "When I grow up, I want to work in a diner." Hannah laughed softly at the declaration, the sound lighter than it had been all evening. Ethan looked at Caleb and said, "Working in a diner means making sure people leave a little happier than when they arrived." Caleb thought about that carefully. "You are good at that," he said. The comment made Ethan pause for a moment, not out of embarrassment, but because he understood the quiet truth inside a child's observation. Hannah glanced between them, and then said something she had not expected to say that night. "You made today easier than the last few months," she admitted gently. Ethan did not respond with a grand speech or a dramatic promise. Instead, he simply nodded once, the same quiet gesture he had offered since the beginning of the evening. "Sometimes one good day is enough to start the next one," he said. And in that simple sentence the booth by the window felt warmer than any heater in the diner could have made it. The Maple Street Grill was nearly empty by the time the clock above the counter reached midnight. The tall man in the expensive coat had already finished his coffee and left without another word, and the quiet diner returned to its familiar late-night stillness. Frank wiped down the counter slowly while the cook in the back turned off one of the grills, the soft clicking sound echoing gently through the room. Outside the windows the streets of Cedar Ridge were calm and quiet, the rain clouds long gone, and the pavement reflecting the pale glow of the streetlights. At the booth near the window Caleb had finally begun to grow sleepy. His excitement from earlier had faded into slow blinks and quiet yawns, the kind that children cannot hide when the day has been longer than expected. Ethan noticed it immediately. "Looks like someone is running out of energy," he said with a warm smile. Caleb rubbed one eye and nodded. "The pie helped, but I think I am tired now." Hannah brushed a hand gently across her son's hair, a small gesture filled with the quiet care of a mother who had spent many nights worrying about where he would sleep. Ethan stood and motioned toward the kitchen door. "Let me show you the storage room," he said calmly. They followed him through the kitchen where the smell of coffee and toasted bread still lingered in the air. Frank looked up from the counter and gave Ethan a small approving nod as they passed. Behind the kitchen, a narrow hallway led to a simple room used for extra supplies. Inside was an old couch, a folded blanket, and a small lamp that cast a soft yellow glow across the walls. It was not fancy, but it was warm and dry and safe. Caleb looked around with quiet amazement. "This is like a secret room," he whispered. Ethan laughed softly. "Every diner has one." Hannah stood near the doorway holding Ethan's jacket around her shoulders, her eyes moving slowly across the small room as if trying to believe it was real. "I do not know how to thank you," she said quietly. Ethan leaned against the doorframe and answered in the same steady tone he had used all night. "You do not have to." Caleb climbed onto the couch and pulled the blanket over his legs, already half asleep. Hannah watched him settle in before turning back toward Ethan. The soft light from the small lamp reflected gently in her eyes. "You have done more than most people would," she said. Ethan shook his head slightly. "I did what anyone should do." Hannah hesitated for a moment, and then asked the question that had quietly grown in her mind all evening. "Why?" Ethan considered the word for a few seconds before answering. "Because kindness should not depend on who deserves it," he said. "Sometimes it just shows up when someone needs it." Hannah looked at him in silence for a moment, the weight she had carried for months seeming a little lighter in the calm air of the small room. Ethan gave a small nod toward Caleb, who was already drifting to sleep. Get some rest, he said gently. Tomorrow morning, we will figure out the next step. Hannah stepped forward slightly, still wrapped in his jacket, and for the first time since the rainy parking lot she allowed herself a small genuine smile. It was quiet and soft, but it carried something stronger than words. And in that quiet moment Ethan Walker realized something that surprised even him. Helping her had not only been about kindness. Somewhere between the rain, the pancakes, and the quiet defense of her dignity, his heart had already begun to care in a way he had not expected.